The sun had no warmth that day, only a cruel brightness that burned down on cracked sidewalks and silent stairs. It was the kind of morning that felt like it was holding its breath. Thick air, slow time, an invisible pulse behind every street corner. Officer Darnell Hayes adjusted his belt, his fingers twitching near the baton at his hip as he scanned the block he didn't want to be patrolling. It was a poor black neighborhood, and he didn't need to say out loud what he thought of it. His silence said enough. His jaw clenched as his eyes locked on the small figure across the street. An elderly black woman in a faded green coat, standing still as a statue, gripping a worn wooden cane like it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. She wasn't blocking traffic, wasn't causing a scene, but something about her, too proud, too calm, scratched at him. His boots thudded across the street like gunshots, and with a sneer that barely masked his contempt, he marched up to her without a word. She met his gaze but didn't flinch, didn't smile. He hated that. Without warning, he yanked the cane from her hand, snapping her off balance. She stumbled but didn't fall, catching herself on the nearby wall, her eyes never leaving his. There was something ancient in her stare, something heavy and unspoken, but he didn't care. The cane clattered against the pavement like a challenge, but the only sound louder was the silence of the bystanders. Silent, not because they didn't care, but because they knew exactly how moments like this always ended. Officer Hayes leaned in close, whispering something low and bitter, thinking he'd shown her who was in charge. What he didn't know, what no one on that corner knew, was that the woman's son was watching from the window of a black car parked just down the street. And that son wore a robe no man dared challenge. The cane lay broken in two pieces on the sidewalk, its splintered wood a quiet scream against the city's roar. The old woman stood without it, trembling slightly, but refusing to bend, not to age, not to gravity, and certainly not to the white officer sneering before her like she was filth on his boots. Officer Hayes stepped back, not out of regret, but out of disgust, wiping his hands like he'd touched something beneath him. "You people never learn," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear, his voice soaked in contempt, like he'd rehearsed that line 100 times. He looked at her coat, threadbare and too large, and saw not a woman, but a stereotype, something he'd been taught to control, not protect. A small crowd had started to gather now, faces behind windows, eyes peeking around corners, but not one dared to speak. They knew better. This wasn't justice, this was ritual. The woman said nothing. Her silence burned deeper than any protest, and it unnerved him. He hated the way she stared at him, like she'd seen this before, too many times to count. Like she knew exactly what kind of man he was before he ever put on the badge. In a twisted mockery of authority, he kicked one half of the cane into the gutter and smirked as it floated down into filth. "Can't walk? Then crawl," he spat, turning away like he'd done something noble, like she was the problem and he the answer. The woman slowly leaned against the wall, her hands steady despite the shake in her knees, her face carved in stone. Behind the tinted window of the car, her son's knuckles went white against the leather interior, his jaw locked so tight it hurt to breathe. He had spent his life mastering silence, dressing it in robes and verdicts and composure. But not this time, not today, because in this moment, he wasn't a Supreme Court judge. He was a son, and something sacred had just been shattered in front of him. As Officer Hayes strutted away with a swagger soaked in false pride, the old woman remained still, her breath shallow, her spine a wavering line between defiance and collapse. Her name was Mrs. Laverne Holloway, and though the world only saw a fragile old black woman in the wrong neighborhood, she had once marched in Selma, had once bled beside dogs and batons, had once buried a brother who never came home from Mississippi. But in this moment, she was nothing more than a target, a symbol of resistance too tired to speak and too proud to kneel. A child passing by on a rusted bike slowed down, wide-eyed, watching her try to lift the ruined cane from the gutter with trembling fingers. Hayes, now standing by his cruiser, shouted across the street, loud enough for the world to hear, "Maybe next time, you people will learn some manners." His voice cut through the air like a whip, the words not just aimed at her, but at everyone, like her, always playing the victim. "Maybe if you learn to obey, You wouldn't need that stick. Laughter echoed from inside the patrol car. Another officer, another badge, another silence. The boy on the bike didn't laugh. He just stared at Mrs. Holloway, then at Hayes, then turned his bike and vanished around the corner like a ghost. Mrs. Holloway lifted her head slowly, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything. She had heard these words before. They were etched into the bones of this country, spoken through slave markets, whispered in the smoke of burning churches, shouted through bullhorns in schoolyards guarded by soldiers. But what pierced deepest now wasn't the insult, it was the loneliness of it. The way the world kept moving like she hadn't just been publicly stripped of her humanity. Hayes climbed into his car, still laughing, like he'd just won something, like there was anything left of her to defeat. But inside that black car parked silently down the block, her son leaned forward, his face unreadable, his breath sharp. He had sentenced murderers. He had debated constitutional law before senators. He had shaken hands with presidents. But nothing had prepared him for this. For watching his mother, his anchor, his origin, his strength, be reduced to debris by a man who had no idea who she was, and worse, didn't care. He reached for his phone, but then stopped. This wasn't for a call. This wasn't for media. This was personal. The gavel would fall, but not in a courtroom. Not this time. Something older had been awakened. Something buried deep in legacy and fire. And once it rose, it would not be gentle. Let's pause for a brief moment. If you're listening to this, let us know in the comments where you're from and whether you've ever witnessed or experienced something like this. Your story matters, and we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to follow so you never miss the next chapter. Now, we continue. The city moved around her like she was invisible. Cars passed, conversations carried on, phones buzzed. And yet, Mrs. Laverne Holloway stood there, hunched but unbroken, as if the street had forgotten how to breathe. The remnants of her cane, one half in her hand, the other swallowed by the gutter, were like relics of dignity abandoned by time. She tried to step forward, but her knee buckled slightly, sending a flash of pain through her body. Still, she didn't ask for help. She wouldn't give them that. Officer Hayes glanced back briefly from the car mirror, not with concern, but to see if the spectacle had ended. To him, it wasn't a woman, just a problem he thought he'd handled. He leaned over to his partner and said, "They always act like we owe them something." His partner grinned without looking up from his phone and replied, "You'd think after all these years they'd learn their place." The words weren't just casual. They were crafted from generations of practiced contempt, passed down in locker rooms and briefings, disguised as law and order. Inside the black car down the street, her son watched his mother from behind tinted glass. But now his hand gripped the door handle. He hadn't moved yet, not because he was afraid, but because he was deciding what part of himself needed to rise: the son, the judge, the witness, or the fury. Laverne took another step. A man on the corner crossed to the other side of the street to avoid her, like her presence had become contagious. A woman looked away. No one offered a hand. No one offered a word, as if helping her would be seen as disobedience, as if caring had become illegal. A group of young boys stood near the bus stop, watching in silence, learning without needing to be taught that respect was a privilege, not a right, and that pain didn't always bleed, it sometimes limped. Hayes opened the cruiser window just a crack and called out one more time, "Don't make a scene next time, Grandma. You're not on a plantation anymore." The boys laughed nervously, unsure if they were supposed to. Mrs. Holloway stopped. She turned her head, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, aching dignity of someone who had carried this burden far longer than anyone watching could imagine. Her eyes met his, and for the first time Officer Hayes felt something he didn't expect. Not fear, not guilt, but the uncomfortable prickle of being seen, not as a man in uniform, but as a small, petty soul exposed by a woman who never bowed, even when the world demanded it. And he hated her for it. The morning stretched on, indifferent to the small, burning injustice playing out in the street. Mrs. Holloway stood, her shoulders heavy with age, but her eyes unwavering, locked on Officer Hayes, who now rolled up the window of his cruiser and leaned back in his seat, trying to erase the weight of the moment from his mind. The streets around him were a blur of sounds. Hustle, movement, the occasional shout. But nothing could drown out the words he had spoken. The mocking, the cruelty. His laughter had faded, but the sting of his actions lingered in the air. Mrs. Holloway was not someone he could dismiss so easily. She was more than the caricature he had painted in his head, more than the shadow of the woman he had tried to break. She was real, too real. He hated it, and he hated her for making him feel it. The world turned its back on Mrs. Holloway, the crowd dissipating, the noise of the city pressing on as though nothing had happened. But the damage had been done. Something raw had been unleashed, and the eyes of those who witnessed it, though they avoided her, carried a weight that was now tied to the very air. Mrs. Holloway, standing as still as ever, wasn't just waiting for her next step. She was preparing herself for a battle that, in truth, she had already fought countless times. One that had been fought for generations, whispered in dark corners, shouted on the streets, and carried in the hearts of the oppressed, the unseen, the forgotten. And yet, somehow, this time was different. Far down the street, hidden behind a tinted window of a sleek black sedan, her son sat, his knuckles tight against the leather of his seat, his breath shallow, his chest tight with the storm of emotions he didn't know how to process. He had seen death in the courtroom. He had sentenced men to their graves with a level of calm that could freeze fire. But what he had just witnessed, the cruelty, the mockery of his mother, was a brand new kind of torment, a wound that cut far deeper than anything he had ever dealt with. It wasn't just an assault on her, it was an assault on him, on his entire existence, on the lineage of his people. The son, Judge Jeremiah Holloway, was a man who had built his reputation in the halls of power, who had walked beside the most influential people in the country. He had come from the same roots as his mother, roots of struggle, of resistance, of an unyielding strength that had carried their family through the darkest times. But now, as he sat behind the glass, his mind was consumed with a single uncontrollable thought. How many times would they allow this? The history of his people was written in blood and struggle, but it wasn't just the blood of his ancestors that haunted him now. It was the blood of the present, the blood of his mother, being drained in slow, unbearable moments like these. He could hear the echoes of the past screaming in his ears, of the lynchings, the Jim Crow laws, the segregated schools, and he could feel it all being laid bare before him, as though the weight of that history had come crashing down, demanding that he do something. His mother's stoic face, the face that had witnessed more suffering than most could imagine, was now something he couldn't look away from. He had always been proud of her resilience, but today, it twisted something deep inside of him. How long could she keep standing, and for what? Jeremiah leaned forward in his seat, his fingers brushing against the door handle. The decision weighed on him, every second stretching longer than the last. His mind raced. He knew the power he held in his hands. He knew the system, the courts, the backroom deals, the connections he could use to make the world see. But he also knew that his mother had spent her life watching those systems fail them, watching the state, the law, the so-called justice turn its back on her and her people, time and time again. He had been taught to rise above, to take the high road, to wear the robes with dignity and never let anger cloud his judgment. But this was different. He could feel the heat building, the knot in his stomach tightening as he stared at the sidewalk where his mother had just been humiliated. His throat burned with something unspeakable. For the first time, he was not just a judge, a man of reason. He was a son, and that son was consumed with an urge to tear down everything that had allowed his mother to be treated this way. His family had fought for freedom, for justice, for respect. But where was it now? The sound of a car engine starting brought him back to the present. The cruiser. Hayes was driving away, his eyes still sneering from the rearview mirror. The officer had no idea who Mrs. Holloway was, or who her son was. But the longer he looked at her with disdain, the more dangerous he became, not just to her, but to himself. Because the line between power and destruction was thin, and sometimes it took nothing more than a moment of arrogance for that line to snap. Jeremiah clenched his jaw, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew exactly what he needed to do. His fingers reached for his phone, the device a tool of connection and destruction in equal measure. He typed quickly, his thoughts focused, his mind racing with the images of his mother standing alone in the street. The message was short, direct, but it carried the weight of everything he had ever been taught to believe in, everything his mother had fought for. His finger hovered over the send button. He could feel the history of his people pushing against him, urging him to act. The words were simple. I want to make a statement. This needs to end. With one swift motion, he pressed send. His mother's fight was no longer hers alone. It was his now. Back on the street, Mrs. Holloway remained motionless. She wasn't ready to walk. Not yet. The fight wasn't over. Her body was tired, aching from the decades of battles she had endured, but her heart burned with a fire that had never died. She looked down at the broken pieces of her cane, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had just happened. The humiliation, the powerlessness. But as she stood there, she felt something else too, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. It was strange, that feeling. Foreign, almost. She had lived her life as a warrior, always on the front lines, always battling for the next generation. She had never asked for help, never begged for sympathy. But in this moment, as the wind stirred the dust at her feet and the streets slowly came back to life around her, she knew that something was about to change. The wheels had already begun to turn. Her son had seen. He was ready. And this time, she would not stand alone. She slowly began to walk again, each step deliberate, every inch a declaration of defiance. She knew the world wouldn't bend for her, but she also knew that she had taught her son how to make it break. And the world, for once, would have no choice but to listen. The days that followed felt like a shifting tide. The streets buzzed with gossip, whispers curling around every corner like smoke, carried on the wind. Some had seen what happened. Some had heard about it. Some pretended not to know at all. But the word spread faster than a wildfire. Officer Darnell Hayes had made a mistake. But what he hadn't realized yet was that this mistake would change everything. Mrs. Laverne Holloway had lived her life in the shadows of a system designed to crush her, a system built on the broken backs of black men and women, a system where the law was nothing more than a weapon wielded by those in power to maintain control, to keep things in their place. She had spent decades fighting it, not just with her fists or words, but with something far more dangerous, her unyielding existence. Every step she took, every breath she drew, was an act of resistance. She had seen the laws of men fail her over and over again, and she had learned to live in the cracks, to navigate a world that had no place for her dignity, only for her silence. But that day, on that street corner, in front of that crowd, with that officer, everything had shifted. It wasn't just the humiliation. It wasn't just the cruel laughter that followed. It was the sudden weight of her son's presence in the world. Judge Jeremiah Holloway had seen it all. And for the first time, he had seen his mother not as a woman of strength, but as a victim. The thought of her in that moment, so small, so broken by the cruel hand of the law that had always kept her in place, sent a surge of rage through him. It was a rage that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. The kind of rage only a child who loved their mother could feel. The kind of rage that couldn't be ignored. And so, without a word, without a moment of hesitation, Judge Holloway had set his plan in motion. He knew the power of the law. He knew the system inside out, had worked with it, around it, through it. He had seen the way it bent and shifted when the right hands were placed upon it. But more than that, he knew how to make it break. This wasn't just a case of one officer overstepping his bounds. This wasn't just about one humiliation in the street. This was about something much larger. This was about a system that needed to be confronted, that needed to be dragged into the light, kicking and screaming if necessary. He wasn't just going to call attention to what had happened. He was going to expose the rot, to show the world what lay beneath the shiny facade of justice. It began with a press conference, the kind of staged event that only people with power could orchestrate. Judge Holloway, with his calm demeanor, his sharp words, and his reputation, stepped in front of cameras, behind podiums, and spoke. His words were measured, carefully chosen, each one a calculated strike against the system that had allowed Officer Hayes's actions to go unchecked. He described his mother's humiliation, not as a personal grievance, but as part of a broader, more insidious pattern. He spoke of the deep-seated racism that permeated the police force, the subtle and overt ways in which black communities were treated as less than human. He painted a picture of a world where the law was wielded like a club, where black people were criminalized simply for existing, where they were expected to endure the crushing weight of discrimination and violence without question. He didn't just accuse Hayes, he accused the entire system that allowed his behavior to thrive. He accused the city's leadership for their failure to address the constant abuse faced by black people at the hands of law enforcement. And most importantly, he accused the citizens who turned away, who refused to intervene, who allowed it all to continue. Enough, he said, his voice steady but thick with the force of his conviction. Enough of the silence. Enough of pretending this is not happening. We cannot, and we will not, allow this to continue. My mother, my people, our lives, are not something to be toyed with. Not anymore. We will be seen. We will be heard. For a brief moment, the city held its breath. It was a call to action, one that resonated deep in the hearts of those who had felt the weight of injustice, who had been forced to live in the shadows of this system for far too long. And for those who had never truly seen it, who had never felt its sting, they began to see the cracks in the facade, the places where the veneer of justice had been worn thin by years of neglect and abuse. But with every action came a reaction. Officer Hayes, who had been so sure of his position, who had never questioned his authority, found himself suddenly exposed. The press was relentless, and while he tried to shrink away from the spotlight, the cameras and questions followed him. His name became synonymous with the shame of that day, the cruelty of his actions. People began to ask, who was he really? What had driven him to lash out like that? Was it a personal vendetta? Was it a deep-seated racism that had been festering under his uniform for years? Or was it just the product of a system that had allowed him to believe he was untouchable? The backlash against him was swift. Protesters gathered outside his precinct, chanting for justice. They stood in front of the city's gates, demanding accountability. But Hayes wasn't the only one under fire. The entire police department was called into question. They tried to dismiss the protests as just another demonstration, but the streets told a different story. The rallies grew in size and intensity. People marched for their dignity, for the memories of those who had been crushed under the boots of officers like Hayes, for the centuries of pain that had been ignored. The city couldn't turn away anymore. And then came the phone call. It wasn't a call that was made to him, not directly. It wasn't even a threat. It was a whisper, a quiet conversation held behind closed doors, among the men and women who had the power to do something about this. But what happened next was almost worse than the attack on his character. They didn't reprimand him. They didn't put him on leave. They didn't remove him from duty. No, they took a different route. The system didn't break. It bent. It always bent. Hayes was transferred to another precinct. Far away, in a neighborhood that didn't quite have the same political weight as the one he had terrorized. He was moved like a chess piece on a board, a pawn to be forgotten, swept under the rug. And with that, the story began to fade from the public eye. The protests died down, the press conferences stopped, and slowly, the city returned to its familiar routine. But not for those who had been paying attention. Not for Mrs. Holloway. Her son had done everything he could to bring the truth to light, to expose the heart of a system that had been built to oppress them. But he knew the harsh reality. The system didn't change with one press conference, no matter how powerful the words. It didn't change because one officer was transferred to a new precinct. It didn't change because a few people marched through the streets, yelling for justice. The system was too entrenched, too vast, too powerful. And those who were in control weren't about to give it up without a fight. For Mrs. Holloway, the fight wasn't over. The humiliation wasn't erased. The system hadn't changed, but her son had. And in the quiet corners of her heart, she knew that the battle would continue. Not just through protests or public speeches, but through every act of defiance, every choice to stand tall in the face of injustice. Because the system might bend, but it would never break the spirit of those who refused to let it. And in that small, quiet victory, Mrs. Holloway knew. They hadn't won yet. The nights grew heavier after the press conference. The city settled into a strange silence, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next inevitable upheaval. But in that silence, beneath the layers of noise and the ongoing protests, something darker was beginning to take root. Mrs. Laverne Holloway had been witness to decades of injustice, each act of cruelty a thread woven into the fabric of her existence. But now, after everything that had happened, she found herself standing at a crossroads. Her son, Judge Jeremiah Holloway, had ignited a fire. He had stood before the world and called for justice. He had called out the system, exposed its rotting core, and now he was wrestling with the consequences. It wasn't the consequences of the press conference. It wasn't the public backlash. It was something deeper, something that lingered just beyond the surface. Jeremiah had spent his life navigating the treacherous waters of power, learning how to speak the language of the elite, how to fit into a world that was not built for people like him, people like his mother. But this was different. This wasn't a case of legal strategy, of carefully worded arguments or subtle manipulation. This was a battle against a system that didn't just favor certain people, it enslaved others. The system had turned a blind eye to the suffering of black bodies for centuries, and now, in one fleeting moment of arrogance, Officer Darnell Hayes had made it personal. But the deeper truth was that Hayes was a pawn, just one small cog in an engine that stretched across the country, across generations, and across every institution. The system, that same system, had made sure that Jeremiah's mother, his family, his people, had never been allowed to break free. It had kept them in chains, in silence, in the shadows. And now, Jeremiah was finding it harder and harder to keep up the charade. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the very foundation of the society he had worked so hard to be a part of. The injustice that had simmered beneath the surface had always been there, and now it was boiling over, threatening to swallow everything in its path. As the weeks wore on, the protests slowly began to fade, but they left a mark on the city. The anger, the rage, the frustration, it didn't disappear. It lingered, settling in the streets like a storm cloud waiting to burst. And though the city had moved on, life had gone back to normal for some, Mrs. Holloway knew better. The silence that had followed the press conference was not peace. It was the calm before a much darker storm. And she was ready for it. She had lived through worse, much worse, and she had learned long ago how to survive in a world that saw her as less than human. But now, something in her had changed. She had always been strong, always been resilient, but now her spirit was galvanized. Her son had shown the world who he was, had exposed the lie that was justice in this country, and he had done it with a quiet strength that terrified those in power. The most dangerous people were never the ones with the loudest voices, but the ones who learned to harness their anger with precision, with purpose. And Jeremiah had done just that. He had taken his pain, his rage, and turned it into a weapon. But as powerful as his words were, as much as they had shaken the foundations of the system, the reality was that the system had not crumbled. It had adjusted. It always adjusted. The officers, the city leaders, the politicians, they had seen this before. They knew how to weather the storm. They knew how to suppress dissent. They knew how to push it all back down. The public spectacle had faded, but the real battle was just beginning. And it was one that would be fought in the shadows, in the hidden rooms of power, in the places where decisions were made that would never be seen by the public eye. This battle would not be won by speeches or protests. It would be won by taking everything that had been built, every inch of the system, and dismantling it piece by piece. It would be won by the people who had been silenced for too long, by those who had been told that their lives didn't matter, that their pain wasn't real, that their voices weren't worthy of being heard. But for now, Mrs. Holloway could only wait. She had waited for years, for decades. She had watched as history repeated itself, as the same patterns of abuse, neglect, and violence played out over and over again. She had watched as men, like Officer Hayes, Men who had never known what it was like to live with the weight of a system designed to crush you, held all the power. And yet, in her heart, she knew something had changed. The world couldn't go on pretending anymore. The lies that had been told, the lies that had been swallowed by generations, were starting to unravel. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down. Jeremiah Holloway sat alone in his office late one night, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood of his desk. The glow of the city outside his window bathed the room in a dim light, casting long shadows across the walls. He had been working tirelessly, trying to figure out the next step in this fight. The press conferences had been a start, but they hadn't done enough. The anger that had been ignited needed to be sustained. It needed to be channeled into something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. He had always believed in the law, in the power of the judiciary to effect change, to bring justice where it was due. But now, he wasn't so sure. He had spent his entire career trying to uphold the ideals of the Constitution, but the more he learned, the more he saw, the clearer it became. The system wasn't broken. It was designed this way. The law was not a tool of justice. It was a tool of control. And those who had the power to change things weren't interested in change. They were interested in maintaining the status quo. The anger that had been growing inside him, the fire that had been lit by the sight of his mother's humiliation, was no longer something he could contain. It was a wildfire, a force of nature that could no longer be ignored. He had spent his life trying to play by the rules, trying to fit into a system that had never truly accepted him. But now he saw the truth. The system was the problem. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as he thought about the road ahead. It was a dangerous path, one that would require sacrifices. But what choice did he have? He couldn't turn away from the truth, not now. His mother had endured more than any person should have to endure, and yet she had never broken. She had fought every day, in every small way, just to survive. And now, it was his turn to fight, not just for her, but for every person who had been crushed beneath the weight of this system. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the screen. It was a message from his mother, one that he hadn't expected. Her words were simple. "It's time. We can't wait any longer. The world has to see us." For a moment, Jeremiah didn't know what to say, but deep down, he knew what she meant. It was time for the reckoning. It was time for them to take back what had been stolen, for them to force the world to confront the ugly truth it had spent so long ignoring. He stood up, his heart racing with the weight of what was about to happen. He had made his decision. He had taken the first step. Now, there was no turning back. The courtroom was silent. The air, thick with the weight of anticipation, seemed to press down on everyone within its walls. The usual hum of whispers, the rustle of papers, the shuffle of feet, they were all absent. In their place, an unspoken tension hung over the room like a storm cloud, a storm that had been gathering for years. This wasn't just any case. This wasn't just about Officer Hayes, about one incident of cruelty on a street corner. No, this was about something much deeper, something that had been festering in the shadows for generations. It was about a system that had been built to oppress and humiliate, and now it was about to face its reckoning. Judge Jeremiah Holloway stood at the bench, his eyes sharp, his face expressionless, but inside he was a maelstrom of emotion. He had spent his entire life trying to fit into a system that had never truly welcomed him, trying to uphold a set of rules that had only ever served to marginalize his people. He had worn the robes of justice, spoken the words of the law, but the more he had learned, the more he had seen, the more it became clear. The law wasn't just broken, it was designed this way. And now he was forced to make a decision that would alter the course of everything. Across the courtroom, sitting behind his legal team, sat Officer Darnell Hayes. He was no longer the confident, arrogant figure he had once been. Gone were the smug smiles and the swagger in his step. Now, he was a man on the defensive, caught in a system that had turned on him. His reputation, once untouchable, was in tatters. The media had dissected every detail of his life, his past actions, his every mistake. He had tried to brush it all off, to hide behind the shield of his uniform, but there was no hiding anymore. The truth had come for him, and it was unforgiving. Hayes had once believed that the badge he wore would protect him, that his position in the police force would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But as he sat there now, under the glare of the courtroom lights, he realized that the protection he had once taken for granted had evaporated. His arrogance, his cruelty, his belief that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence, it had all led him here, to this moment, where he would have to face the wrath of a system that had long been built on his back and the backs of men like him. The prosecution began, the words sharp and piercing, each one a nail in Hayes's coffin. They painted a picture of a man who had used his authority not to protect, not to serve, but to humiliate and degrade. They called witness after witness, each recounting the event on that fateful day when Hayes had torn the cane from Mrs. Holloway's hand, when he had mocked her, when he had treated her like less than human. The words were hard to listen to, each one an indictment of everything the officer stood for. But it wasn't just the witnesses who were speaking. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were waiting for justice to be served. The audience, a mix of concerned citizens, activists and reporters, was on the edge of their seats, eyes fixed on the proceedings. They knew this wasn't just about one officer. This was about all the officers, all the people who had used their power to oppress and demean. This was about the entire system of law enforcement that had allowed this behavior to go unchecked for so long. The weight of the room was overwhelming, and as the prosecution finished, the tension was palpable. Then, it was the defense's turn. Hayes's lawyer, a slick, well-groomed man, rose to his feet. His voice was smooth, calculated as he began to speak. He tried to paint a different picture of Hayes. A man who had been under stress. A man who had made a mistake. A man who had never intended for things to escalate like they did. He spoke of the dangerous environment the police worked in, the constant threat they faced, the split-second decisions they were forced to make. He tried to paint Hayes as a victim of circumstance, a product of a system that was too tough, too demanding, too chaotic. But the defense's argument felt hollow, like a thin veil stretched too tight over the truth. The words didn't resonate with the room the way they had hoped. The audience wasn't buying it. They had heard it all before. The same excuses, the same justifications, the same attempts to deflect blame. And they were tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the excuses. Tired of being told that their pain, their suffering, their humiliation didn't matter. As Hayes's lawyer finished, the room went silent. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment, for the verdict to be handed down. Everyone knew it was coming. Everyone knew that this was the moment when the system would either break or hold its ground. And all eyes turned to Judge Holloway, who sat at the bench, his gaze fixed on Hayes, his mind focused on the case before him. Jeremiah Holloway's heart pounded in his chest. This was his moment. He had the power to make a decision that would ripple through the entire country. He had the power to send a message, not just to Officer Hayes, but to every person who had ever used their power to oppress, to humiliate, to dehumanize. He had the power to tear down the system that had allowed this to happen, the system that had protected men like Hayes for so long. But as he sat there, staring at Hayes, the weight of the decision before him felt heavier than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just passing judgment on one man. He wasn't just deciding the fate of a single officer. No, this was about something much bigger. This was about all the people who had been crushed under the weight of the system for generations. This was about his mother, his ancestors, his people. This was about history itself, and whether or not it would continue to repeat itself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jeremiah Holloway stood. The room fell into complete silence, the kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice steady, yet filled with the gravity of the moment. "Officer Darnell Hayes," he began, his words measured but powerful. "You have stood before this court today, and you have been given the opportunity to explain your actions. But it is not your words that matter. It is your actions that speak the loudest. He paused, his gaze never leaving Hayes's eyes. On that day, you used your position of power to humiliate a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. You mocked her. You tore from her the very thing that allowed her to stand tall in this world. You treated her with the same contempt that has been visited upon my people for centuries. There was a brief pause before he continued. I do not speak of this as a judge, but as a son who has seen his mother endure more than any human being should ever have to endure. A son who has watched his people suffer under the weight of systems that were never designed to protect them, but to keep them down. And I will not allow you or anyone to erase their humanity, not anymore. The courtroom was still. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Therefore, Jeremiah continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, I find you guilty. Guilty of abuse of power. Guilty of racial discrimination. And guilty of the violation of the very principles of justice that you swore to uphold. As the words left his mouth, the room seemed to explode with emotion. Some people stood and cheered. Others wept, and others, those who had long believed in the system, sat in stunned silence. Officer Hayes, his face pale and strained, looked like a man who had just realized that the walls were closing in around him. There was no escape from this moment, no place to hide. His world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But for Mrs. Laverne Holloway, who stood silently at the back of the courtroom, there was a quiet sense of vindication. This was the moment her people had been waiting for. This was the moment that had been earned through blood, sweat, and tears. This was the moment when the tide had shifted. The storm had come, and at last, justice had been served. The courtroom had erupted in chaos, the tension in the air palpable as the verdict fell from Judge Jeremiah Holloway's lips. The weight of his decision hung heavily over the room. His words echoed in the minds of those who had witnessed the trial. Guilty. There had been no hesitation, no room for doubt. The system had finally been forced to confront itself. Officer Darnell Hayes had been exposed for what he truly was, a man who abused his power, a man who had perpetuated the same cycle of violence and racism that had plagued this country for centuries. But as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, a new reality began to set in. The room, once filled with hope and determination, now buzzed with an uneasy feeling. The conviction was only the beginning. The real fight was far from over. Outside the courthouse, the city had exploded into a frenzy. News of the guilty verdict had spread like wildfire, sparking celebrations among those who had long fought for justice. The black community, in particular, was filled with a sense of vindication. For too long, they had been forced to watch as their people were mistreated, dehumanized, and left to suffer under a system that seemed impervious to change. But now, for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, a sign that the tide was finally turning. But as the celebrations grew louder, a darker, more insidious force began to stir beneath the surface. The systems of power that had long sustained the status quo were not going to let this moment pass without a fight. The police, the politicians, the wealthy elite, they were all feeling the pressure, and they were not about to allow their grip on power to slip away so easily. In the days following the trial, a quiet but relentless campaign of resistance began to unfold. It wasn't public. It wasn't loud. It was a campaign of backroom deals, of covert actions designed to undermine the victory that had been won. Hayes had been convicted, but the people behind him, the ones who had enabled him, the ones who had built the system that protected men like him, were determined to find a way to erase the impact of the verdict. For Judge Jeremiah Holloway, the days following the trial were filled with pressure. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The moment he had exposed the truth, he had become a target. Those in power saw him as a threat, and they would stop at nothing to discredit him, to remove him from the equation. The phone calls started coming in, the subtle threats disguised as polite requests for his time. They wanted him to back down, to let the dust settle, to let the world return to normal. But Jeremiah was no fool. He knew that normal wasn't going to work anymore. The moment he had taken a stand, he had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. His mother, Laverne, had always told him that in order to change the world, he would have to be willing to sacrifice everything. The victory in the courtroom had been sweet, but it was just the beginning. They had taken one step, but the road ahead was long and fraught with danger. The system wasn't just going to roll over because of one conviction. It was going to fight back, and fight back it did. The first wave of retaliation came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Judge Holloway began to notice small, subtle changes in the way things were handled. His cases were being delayed. His court hearings were being pushed to the back of the schedule. The cases he presided over started to become increasingly difficult, filled with roadblocks and technicalities designed to slow him down. The phone calls became more frequent, more threatening, but still, he stood firm. In the meantime, Mrs. Holloway had found herself caught between two worlds. She had lived her life in a constant state of survival. She had seen it all, the bloodshed, the pain, the humiliation, but never before had the stakes been so high. She had always known that there was power in her son, in his position, in his ability to bring about change, but now she was beginning to see just how dangerous that power could be. The enemies they had made were not the type to let a defeat go unpunished. They were a part of a system that had been built on oppression and violence, and they would do whatever it took to protect it. The second wave of retaliation came quickly, and it was more public, more visible. A smear campaign was launched against Jeremiah, attempting to discredit him, to paint him as a man who was too emotional, too biased, too unfit to serve in the judiciary. They dug into his past, searching for any misstep, any mistake, any weakness they could exploit. They found none, of course. Jeremiah had been meticulous in his career, his reputation solid and unblemished. But they didn't need facts. They just needed doubt. The media, ever complicit in the game of power, played its part. They took the whispers, the rumors, and the half-truths and turned them into headlines. Judge Holloway, a man too dangerous for justice. Holloway's family ties exposed. Is he really the champion of justice? The smear campaign spread across social media like wildfire, feeding the narrative that Jeremiah had become a radical, an extremist, a man who could no longer be trusted to hold the scales of justice. And then came the threats. They started small at first. Anonymous phone calls, notes left on his car, disturbing messages from unknown numbers. But soon, the threats grew bolder. His family was targeted. His mother, his friends, even his colleagues began to receive messages, warnings, intimidation. They were telling him, stop, or else. But Jeremiah was not one to back down. His mother had taught him that silence was a weapon of oppression, and he had never been one to remain silent. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. And even as the walls closed in around him, he stood firm. But the pressure was mounting. The system had not just resisted, it had fought back with everything it had. And slowly, methodically, it was starting to break him. Every day felt like a war. Every decision, every ruling, every step he took was scrutinized, dissected, twisted into something it wasn't. The weight of the system's retaliation was heavy, and Jeremiah could feel it pressing in from all sides. Then, one day, it all came to a head. He arrived at work to find that his office had been broken into. Files were missing. Documents were scattered across the floor. His personal things had been rifled through, his security compromised. But that wasn't what shook him to his core. No, what shook him was the message left behind. Scrawled across his desk in bold red letters were the words, "You can't fight us." It was a threat, pure and simple, a declaration of war. But Jeremiah Holloway was not a man who could be intimidated. He had fought too hard, endured too much, to be cowed by threats. The system had tried to break him, had tried to scare him into submission. But he would not go down without a fight, not for his mother, not for his people, and certainly not for the countless others who had suffered under the boot of that very system. As the days passed, the weight of the battle only grew heavier. The attacks became more frequent, more intense, but through it all, Jeremiah remained steadfast. He refused to be broken. He refused to be silenced. And then, in the midst of it all, he received an unexpected call. It was from his mother. "Jeremiah," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen this fight before. It's not easy, and it's not over. But we didn't get this far just to stop now. We have a chance. Don't let them win. Keep going." Her words were a reminder of everything they had fought for, everything they had endured. It was a reminder that the battle for justice, for dignity, for respect would never be easy. But it was a battle worth fighting. And so, with his mother's words echoing in his mind, Jeremiah Holloway stepped back into the fray. He would not be the one to back down. He would not be the one to let the system have its way. The war was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because the fight for justice was never a fight you could win alone. It was a fight that required every ounce of strength, every piece of dignity, and every breath you had left. And Jeremiah Holloway was prepared to give it all. The city was bathed in twilight, the streets humming with the buzz of activity, but there was a palpable unease in the air. The world had seen what had happened. They had watched as Officer Darnell Hayes was convicted. They had cheered as Judge Jeremiah Holloway had stood tall, demanding justice for his mother, for his people, for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of systemic racism. The first victory had been won, but the battle was far from over. For weeks now, the battle had raged, not just in the courts, but in the streets, in the homes, and in the hearts of the people. The smear campaigns had escalated. The media had turned their venomous gaze on Judge Holloway, attempting to paint him as a radical, a danger to the very foundations of the law he had sworn to uphold. The threats had become more frequent, more vicious, but through it all, Jeremiah stood resolute. He had come to understand, in a way he never had before, the true nature of power. It was never about right or wrong. It was about who controlled the narrative, who controlled the institutions, and who controlled the story. But now, the story had shifted. It had been nearly a month since the trial. The conviction of Officer Hayes had sent shockwaves through the city, but the higher-ups, the ones who had long been in control, had never truly relinquished their grip. They had fought back in the shadows, undermining the movement for justice, working tirelessly to weaken Jeremiah's position, to push him into a corner where he would have no choice but to back down. But they underestimated the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. In the dead of night, as the city slept, the sound of an approaching protest could be heard from across the street. This was no ordinary protest. It wasn't just a group of angry voices crying for justice. It was an entire movement, a groundswell of resistance that had been building for years, and now it had found its voice. Led by the very people who had spent their lives under the boot of oppression, the rally grew in strength as it wound its way through the streets, gathering momentum with every step. And at the center of it all, leading the charge, was Mrs. Laverne Holloway. Jeremiah had always known his mother was strong, but the fire that burned in her eyes now was something he had never seen before. She was no longer just the woman who had borne the weight of her family's struggle. She was no longer just the grandmother, the mother, the survivor. She was the embodiment of everything that had been ignored, suppressed, and buried for far too long. The march to City Hall had been a long one. It had been a fight to get the people to stand up, to get them to believe in the possibility of change. But now, as they gathered at the steps of the building that symbolized all that they had fought against, there was a palpable sense of power in the air. It was the power of unity, the power of people who were no longer willing to be silenced. The chants grew louder as Mrs. Holloway took her place at the front of the crowd, her voice rising above the others. She stood tall, unbowed, and her words pierced through the night. "This is our fight," she shouted, her voice echoing through the streets. "This is not about one man. It's not about one police officer. It's about all of us who have been treated like we don't matter, like our lives mean nothing. It's time for us to take back what is ours. We are not the invisible ones anymore. We are not the silent ones. We are here, and we will be heard." The crowd erupted in cheers. It wasn't just a protest now. It was a movement, a tide that was rising, one that couldn't be stopped. Jeremiah watched from his office, his eyes fixed on the crowd gathering below. He could hear the chants, feel the vibrations in the air. For a moment, he let the weight of it all settle in. His mother had always been a quiet warrior, but today she had found her voice, and in doing so, had awakened the voice of an entire community. He knew that this was the moment of truth. The system that had held him, his family, and his people in its grip was now under siege. They had fought for so long, endured so much, and yet they had never been heard. But now, in this moment, everything was different. He had spent his life trying to change the system from the inside, trying to work within its confines. But as he looked at the sea of people below, he realized that it was not the system that needed to change. It was the people who needed to change it. As the protest raged on, a figure emerged from the crowd, a man in a suit, with a cold, calculating smile. He was a political figure, someone who had spent years quietly consolidating power behind the scenes, someone who had always known how to play the game. But today, his smile faltered as he walked past a row of police officers, noticing that they didn't seem as loyal as they once had. They were watching the crowd now, not with the sternness of enforcers, but with the hesitation of men who had begun to question where their true allegiance lay. For a moment, he paused, staring at the gathering. His thoughts were a swirl of disbelief and concern. The quiet undercurrent of resentment that had always simmered in the background had exploded into something more, and it wasn't going away. Not now, not ever again. "Get them under control," the politician muttered to his assistant, his voice tinged with nervousness. But his assistant hesitated. "They're not going anywhere, sir," he said quietly. "They're not afraid anymore." The words hit the politician like a slap. The game had changed. He could see it in their eyes. The determination, the resolve. This wasn't just a protest. It was the beginning of a revolution. And for the first time, he realized something that had eluded him for years. The people had power. Real power. As the night wore on, the sound of chanting grew louder. The politicians inside City Hall watched the protest from their windows, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic in their hearts. They had spent decades keeping this very moment at bay, keeping the people oppressed, silent, fearful, and now they were beginning to realize that their hold on power was slipping. The world they had built, the system they had crafted, was crumbling before their eyes. But Mrs. Holloway was not afraid. She stood on the steps of City Hall, her voice rising above the chaos. "We are not done," she cried. "We will not stop until we see change, until we see justice, until we see equality for all. No more. No more silence. No more fear." As the crowd surged forward, an unexpected force of unity and power swept through them. They were no longer just individuals, no longer just isolated voices crying for justice. They were a collective, a single, unstoppable force. The tide had turned. The reckoning had come. And as the first rays of the morning sun broke through the horizon, the city knew that the world had changed. The people had been heard. And the battle for justice, for equality, for dignity would not stop. Not today. Not ever. This was not just the end of a struggle. It was the beginning of a new era. An era where no one would be silenced. An era where those who had been oppressed for so long would finally be free. The system would never be the same again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your life? Your experiences are incredibly valuable to us, and we truly appreciate each and every one of you for being a part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed the story. Your support means the world to us. Have a wonderful day, and if you've listened to this all the way through, feel free to share a phrase that resonates with you from the story so we know you're with us until the end.